Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another elucidating session of ENG4E. That is grade 12 workplace preparation English, brought to you by Wassa Distance Education Center. Today's date is Wednesday, April the 5th, 2023. Hope everything is okay with you where you are, where you're listening from, and we're in the midst of a not as a brutal of a storm as we may have thought it would be, but it's still pretty frosty and kind of nasty out there. So hopefully you're warm and staying safe. Today's class marks class number 30 of ENG4E. And so with this week, we have been doing a novel study because I felt that we needed more time to discuss the novel Where the Rivers Meet. So for week number 8, I picked 4 chapters for us to look at in greater detail. We started with chapter 3 on Monday. We did chapter 8 yesterday, and today we're going to have a look at chapter 12. So I will read out selected passages from that chapter, from chapter 12, and then we'll discuss the elements of narrative that we've been using in this class throughout, right? So we're looking at this novel through the elements of narrative such as characters and plot and setting, theme and conflict. So these key ways that we can understand a novel, a work of literature, right? So, and really, it's just providing you ways to talk about a piece of writing, right? Because you just need to have the tools and to understand how you can break something down and talk about it and compare it with other people. And so it's just learning how to see how a novel comes together and kind of breaking it down. And if you ever see yourself writing, if you ever see yourself writing fiction or nonfiction or just writing your own life story, this is where literature is really important to do, to break it down, to see how it's working, to see how it's making its message be known to the readers, right? So that's what we're doing today. And by doing so, you are preparing yourself to complete the assignments in Unit 2. So at some point, I'm going to create a playlist that's got Unit 2 and this novel study. So these classes are really going to be helpful for you for completing Unit 2 of this course, especially the culminating activity, which asks you to delve into that novel and talk about it. But it's also going to help you with writing your final exam, because the final exam, as I mentioned, will have questions about this novel. So here's some important dates to keep in mind. We are in week 8 of term 2A. Please note that our office, the Wassa office in Sioux Lookout, will be closed on Friday, April the 7th, 2023. We are closed for Good Friday. And I'm not sure what the situation is going to be like in your community, but just keep in mind that your DEC, your learning center may be closed, and other resources that you may rely upon might be closed on that date, this coming Friday. There's no class on Monday, April 10th for Easter Monday, so our office is closed for 4 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. We will have our final 3 classes next week. So we will broadcast 3 times next week, and that'll be the end of this class. That'll be the end of term 2A. Term 2B starts the week after that, and you have till April 11th to register for term 2B. And that's, of course, the final term of the school year, and which, of course, means that the graduation day is coming up. So June 15th is graduation day. That is the most important date that you need to have first and foremost in your mind. You need to know that graduation is coming, and If you've just started this journey, if you've just started down the path of getting your Ontario Secondary School diploma, graduating high school, and it's going to take you at least another school year, maybe 2 school years, then you're not really worried or even thinking about that June 15th graduation date. But here's the thing: if you've put work in already, if you've submitted work to your teacher, you've been getting graded feedback, you're making your way, you need to finish that course before June 15th. You can't transfer it over to next year. All the work you put in this school year has got to go towards getting you a credit. So I don't want to see any students have to start from scratch in September 2023. I want you to finish out these last 2 terms, get your credit now, and more importantly, for those who are approaching graduation, get those final credits in and get that diploma, get that piece of paper, right? So, but you can't do that if June 16th rolls around and you're not done yet. All right, so with that in mind, we'll talk about our course schedule. So we have covered units 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you have questions about units 1, 2, 3, and 4, if you would like to see someone explain the questions, because that's what I do in my broadcasts, in my classes, I try to give you insights into answering those questions and give you lots of information to help you answer those questions. So if you're stuck on an assignment from units 1, 2, 3, or 4, go back to my previous classes. They're all up on my YouTube channel. We're going to spend all of week 8 doing our novel study, and then week 9, which will be 3 classes. We'll spend 3 classes next week just talking about the final exam. So it'll actually be a combination of reviewing key concepts and main ideas and trying to make sure that you understand what's required of you to pass that exam. I mentioned this in my previous broadcast just an hour ago, that both students and teachers have responsibilities, right? And so and don't forget that, right? So don't forget that your teacher has a responsibility to you, and your teacher has a responsibility to tell you what's going to be on that final exam, right? They're not going to show you the questions, and they're not going to photocopy last year's exam and show it to you, right? But they have a responsibility to make sure that you know before you sit down to write that, you know what skills you're going to be tested upon, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to show you some questions that are very similar to an exam question you might get, and we'll have a look at an article. We'll do some writing assignments, right? So we'll just do lots of practice together, and then I'm also going to talk about some strategies, some mental strategies you can employ when writing an exam, because writing an exam can often be a highly stressful situation, but I think if you approach it in a certain way and if you keep a couple of techniques in mind, I think it'll really help with that stress. So thanks for tuning in. If you're listening to us out there on the airwaves at 91.9 FM or perhaps on Bell ExpressVu channel 972, you can phone the studio at 1-807-737-4017 or 1-800-465-7144. And you can listen to us. You can engage with us on Zoom. So if you wanna listen to this discussion live, so if you're, for example, if you're watching my video on YouTube, just know that you can do this live and join us and ask a question and participate and tell us a story, tell us a joke, whatever you want to do. And if you go to zoom.us, you can access Zoom on a computer or just open up the Zoom app on your phone and then go to 417-6699-799. That is my meeting ID. Look up Laverty Wassa on YouTube, and then you can find all of the ENG4E playlists. So do that. All of the playlists are organized by unit. There's one playlist that has all of the classes from term 2A, and then they're also divided into units, so units 1, 2, 3, and 4. And just this week, I started a brand new playlist for the novel study. And then there'll be a playlist that talks about the final exam. So just making it easier for you to find what you need. Please reach out to me directly by email, mlaverty@nnecschools.org. That's MLAVERTY@nnecschools.org. And you can find me on Facebook Messenger. So search for Laverty Wasa on Facebook. So LAVERTY space WAHSA. That's my professional Facebook account where you can ask me questions, send me assignments, whatever the case may be. A lot of WASA educators and administrators and counselors are on Facebook, and if you just search for WASA, you'll find the WASA page and you'll find lots of people on WASA. Please phone our office at 1-807-737-1488 or 1-800-667-3703. That's the toll-free long-distance number. My extension is 2211, and you can dial 0 if you just need to speak. If you don't know who to talk to and you just have a question, then I would just dial 0, get a receptionist. Want to give you an idea of where you should be in this course. If you've put 7.5 weeks in, then you should have read the study guide, all 4 units. You should have read the entire novel. You should have assignments from units 1, 2, and 3 completed, and you should be starting on those assignments in unit 4. And so that's what I encourage students to do. So if you're watching my YouTube videos or you're listening live and following along, that's the progress that you should be at. And you should be completing the units about a week after we stop talking about them, if that makes sense, right? So, once we've stopped talking about a unit. So we stopped talking about unit 4 last week. We ended our discussion after we did the culminating activity. And so in the weeks after that, then you're finishing those assignments. All right, so we will look, today's lesson, we'll look at an article of the day, and we'll continue our novel study. We'll have a look at chapter 12. We will review the elements of style. Forgot to change it again. Elements of Style is a really good book that I love, and Elements of Narrative is the concept of, just the elements of a work of fiction that we can use to talk about it intelligently. Elements of narrative being characters, narrative, plot, theme, conflict, those things. So we're gonna look at those elements of narrative as we take a closer look at chapter 12 of Where the Rivers Meet. We'll also review some key questions from Unit 2, so your chapter summaries and your chapter review questions. And now here's your success criteria. You will gain a deeper understanding of our novel and make more connections within the text and to your own life. So that's a really big one, but that's what I'm really hoping you can do, is you can get a deeper understanding of the novel. So I think that's where what I love the most. I took many English courses in university, and it was always great to just the teachers go out and buy this book, or go to the library and buy this book, and then you read the book, and you think you know what the book's about. You think you're a pretty smart guy in my case, and you read the book and you're like, okay, I get it, it's about this, and the deeper lessons are about this. And then you sit there and you listen to 2 or 3 classes from an expert on that book, or an expert in that sort of time period, right? I remember taking a course on Civil War literature, And I took it because it was the only thing that was sort of left and the only class that I could take. And I wasn't really pumped up to read books from the 1880s about American society and, before the Civil War, after the Civil War. Was never really on my radar, didn't really care. But then I took a course on it, and then I really loved some of these books. I did the Red Badge of Courage. That's the one that really stands out for me. So it's about a young boy who is enlisted, and he has to go fight in the Civil War, but he's afraid, and he sort of like backs away from the war, and he's like an artist, and he sees the world through like famous painters, and really cool book, right? And it just helps when someone who's spent more time with the book than you have can just sort of um, give you a deeper understanding of it. And I think it's my opinion, but I think I think there's not much point to reading novels if it doesn't make you think about your own life, right? I think we read novels, and I think that novels really and fiction in general just helps you see the world from somebody else's eyes, and I think that is like truly important. But I think you do that to change how you think about your own life, right? And to kind of challenge your own ideas and how you think. When I read Where the Rivers Meet, I'm constantly comparing my high school experience to Nancy's, right? And how bad I thought I had it, right? And how angry and confused I felt at that age. But then I compare it to what she's going through, and it gives me a whole different perspective, right? And so you'll do that, and you'll also practice ways of analyzing a text by looking at its format, its organization, its content, etc., and share your insights, right? Because really, this chorus is generally divided into two different approaches, right? You are reading the work of other people and analyzing you're analyzing stuff that they wrote and they produced, and you're looking at it by its format, its purpose, how it's put together, and then you're sharing your thoughts on that. So you're speaking intelligently about things that other people have written, and then you are then writing stuff. You are the creator, right? So it's really a two-part process, but those two processes are very strongly connected to each other. And I know I've used that example many times in this class, but I am a guitar player, and I've written a few songs, and I think it's impossible to be a songwriter if you're not like in love with music, and you listen to music and you try to figure it out. It's same with painting, with sculpting, with woodworking, any kind of creative activity. You're constantly looking at what other people do and enjoying it, but also breaking it down and seeing how they wrote it, and maybe seeing how you would do it differently, right? So we read to become better writers, and when we write, we also become better readers, right? So it's very cyclical. It's very kind of back and forth, right? So you've got to be you need both to be a communicator, right? You have to be able to understand what other people are doing, and you have to be able to understand the messages coming from you from other people, and then you've also got to be able to communicate back to them, right? All right, so the article of the day is from the Globe and Mail. This is from last May, and the headline is BC high school journalists advocate for student press freedom bill that is a first in Canada. So I chose this article because it's about young people, not unlike Nancy, our main character, our protagonist from Where the Rivers Meet, who are doing kind of amazing things and sort of fighting for what they think is right. So the caption reads, Jessica Kim and Spencer Eisen with the Griffin's Nest newspapers at Van Press Printers in Burnaby, BC on May 5th. The Eric Hamber Secondary School students drafted the Student Press Freedom Act. Okay, so these are advocates. They're fighting for what they think is right. Have a quick look at the headline. BC high school journalists advocate for student press freedom bill. That is a first in Canada. So BC high school. So BC is of course British Columbia, and high school is a hyphenated word that it's one idea, but they both modify the word journalist, right? So journalists are the subject of this sentence, this headline. And so we're not just talking about journalists, we're talking about high school journalists. And we're not just talking about high school journalists, we're talking about high school journalists who are from BC, right? So that's two adjectives that modify the noun journalist. Advocate is what they're doing. So these journalists advocate. That's a great verb, right? They advocate for. For is a preposition. Prepositions tell us they are relationship words. They tell us where something occurred. They tell us when it occurred. So under, over, beside. They tell us when, like during, after. And they also tell us like relationships, like I'm doing this for you, right? Please do this with me, right? Those are prepositions. For, with. And they're advocating for student, another adjective, student press freedom bill. So it's a bill. So it's a piece of legislation that they want the government to pass. So it's a student press freedom bill. That, which is an adverb. Adverbs are kind of they're adverbs. Most commonly, they describe how something is done, and most commonly, it's like she spoke quickly, right? So spoke is the verb, quickly is the adverb. He organized efficiently, right? So he planned accordingly, right? So it's how something was done. So in this case, this bill, that is there's three articles in the English language, a, an, and the. So in this case, we have a. The first in Canada. So this bill is the first in Canada of its kind. So it's first is an adjective. It tells us something about the bill. In is a preposition, and of course Canada is a noun. It's a proper noun because it mentions a specific person, place, or thing. All right, now we'll just have a look at the article. A student newspaper at Eric Hamber Secondary School was ready last year to publish a new issue featuring an editorial that criticized the lack of consultation in the Vancouver School Board's decision-making process. Quote, it is often unclear when, if, and how the VSB, that's the Vancouver School Board, uses student and teacher input to create policy. There needs to be greater transparency on the direct correlation between student and teacher voice and board action, reads the May 2020 editorial of the Griffin's Nest. Right, so that's a school paper, right? So the Griffin's Nest published that statement. But when the Nest editor-in-chief, Spencer Eisen, swung by an Eric Hamber administrator's office, informing him by custom that the preprint copy was ready to review, the team was asked if the paper contained anything controversial, and was told the issue needed to be the principal's. He was told the issue needed the principal's, quote, blessing. The administrator had apparently been notified to the issue after the VSB forwarded Mr. Eisen's request for comment to Eric Hamber. Mr. Eisen, an enthusiast of constitutional and media law, regarded the exchange as a threat to his freedom of expression and defined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He and Jessica Kim, who was the paper's managing editor, hopped on the SkyTrain after school that day and headed to the office of the BC Civil Liberties Association. Their trip touched off a year of advocacy aiming at offering student journalists the same protections afforded to other journalists, culminating in a draft student press freedom bill that is the first of its kind in Canada. So I thought that was a really cool story, and so it's about protecting the freedom of expression for young people in BC, but I think it's going to be Canada wide. Be interesting to do a follow up and see where this press freedom bill has been taken, right? So, and you could definitely see how if a bunch of high school students printed something that made their school look bad or made their school board look bad, you could see how they could be pressured to not talk about it and to talk about something different and to be silenced and to be censored, right? So I think this was. I've been trying to find articles written about British Columbia because that's the setting for our novel, and so I thought that was a really cool story about these two young people. And so, since this article was published last May, yeah, it'd be interesting to see where they have where they've ended up with that legislation. All right, so today we're going to look at chapter 12, and it's just a good time to put up the guided reading questions. So the guided reading questions are given to you to make sure that you've read the novel and you have a basic understanding of it. This is a very common practice you find with many English choruses, especially at a high school level. It's just ensuring you've read the novel and are following along with it, and it just helps you keep track of the plot points and what happened in the book. So question 32 states, what does Mrs. Schmidt suggest to Nancy about the importance of ancestors as they are preparing for the sweat? 33, is the sweat a good experience for Nancy at first? Explain. 34, on page 94, water is mentioned as a symbol. What is it symbolic of? 35, what does Mrs. Schmidt ask Nancy to pray for? 36, what is the significance of the, quote, rocks? And 37, who is Chucha Pout? I hope I'm pronouncing that Shusha word correctly. I may not be, but that's the... I am trying my best. Okay. So those are the chapter review questions that I'd like you to keep in mind. And then also keep in mind the guided chapter, the chapter reflection. So just know that you have to write about 6 chapters. And I've talked about 4. I'm going to talk about 4 of them this week, so you could pick those 4. And so I'm just trying to make that a bit easier for you. So write about each one. You're simply doing a reflection. You're not making an argument. You're not proving a case. You're just simply reflecting upon it. What does this article mean to me? What does this chapter mean to me? And you might want to use the elements of narrative. So, and then we'll talk about them today as we go through these selected passages. Okay, so let's jump into it. I'll keep the plot one up. Chapter 12. The sky grew pink in the east, glowing so that the mountains stood out in dark relief. Blackness remained in the west, with the brightest star still suspended above the shadows of the narrow valley. Nancy sat outside her simple tent, really just a tarpaulin pegged down over a rope tied between 2 fir trees, and looked around the clearing that had become so familiar. Taking out her knife, she cut a notch in the branch stuck in the rocks next to her and counted them all once more, to be sure. 30. This was her last morning. Okay? So the plot, we got right off the bat, we've got Nancy, Nancy, counts her days. 30. Counts her days, on the spirit quest. So in the previous chapters, yesterday's discussion, we talked about chapter 8, where Nancy agrees with her father's suggestion that she approach Mrs. Schmidt and that Mrs. Schmidt can help her and maybe even transform her, right? And so by chapter 12, she has spent a lot of time with Mrs. Schmidt, and Mrs. Schmidt has done her best to prepare this young woman for a spirit quest and her 30 days spent by herself, right? Out in the wilderness. And so, the setting for this is, I'll just say out in the forest. Nancy describes nature. quite beautifully. When we think back to the opening chapter or the opening paragraph of chapter 8 is, um, Nancy is sort of disconnected from her environment, and she can see nature and she can describe it, but she doesn't really feel any connection to it. It actually kind of makes her even more sad. I'm just making the observation that many chapters open with with nature, slash, Nancy describing the landscape, right? It would be interesting to look at the entire novel and break it down chapter by chapter and just see how many of these chapters, open with Nancy talking about nature and talking about the beauty of her surroundings. She sat naked, oblivious to the early morning chill, and put her fingers in the smudge she'd made by burning cedar boughs. Carefully she dabbed the black soot on her forehead. As she did so, the prayers came easily and simply. Give me strength that I will be able to think clearly. She brushed the smudge over her ears, eyes, and mouth, saying, Purify my ears that I will only hear what is good, my eyes so that I will only see good, my mouth so that I will speak good. She drew her she drew her fingers over her breast, saying, Fill my heart with love. Take all evil out of my heart. She continued over her legs and body, begging for strength. She sat quietly then, still, like the trees around her. She watched as the pink hue expanded slowly across the eastern sky. Only the low rush of the stream running through the rocks 10 feet to her left broke the silence. Not even the birds had awakened yet. She stood up, taking fir bough from the pile next to her tent, and walked toward the small river. Reaching it, she sat down on a flat stone near the pool in the clearing and stared across the dark surface. It was calm and smooth, moving slowly until it finally spilled by several enormous boulders that backed up the stream into this perfect circle. So that's a beautiful description of nature. That's the first three paragraphs, and you can just see how Nancy has begun to heal, and the Nancy that we knew from chapter 8. I would say Nancy's a character, of course, in this chapter, and she's in a better place. I would say emotionally, spiritually, physically, right? So mind, body, and soul. She's doing better. She's in a better place, right? She's you know as compared to chapter 8. I chose chapter 8 for that reason, because it's certainly, I think when you read the novel, I think that's like the depth of her sadness. That's when she's sort of hit rock bottom and she doesn't know what to do, and I don't think that she's not as mentally damaged and broken as Barry was to drive him to do what he did. But I think that she was certainly going down that path, and it's great that she avoided that fate. But she's in a much better place here, and so far she's the only character, in the story so far. So I'm reading from page 102 now. The first days had been the hardest. Mrs. Schmidt had brought her here and helped her set up a tent and build a small sweat house. Despite the training she'd already received from the old woman, Nancy dreaded her leaving and tried to find ways of making her stay. Finally, she clutched her arm, trembling. I don't think I can do it, Mrs. Schmidt. I'm scared. I really am. Mrs. Schmidt told her Mrs. Schmidt held her and spoke soothingly. What are you afraid of? The animals don't dislike you. Talk to them. Talk to the river and the trees. They are your sisters and your brothers, your friends. Nancy looked around but found little comfort in the tall, silent trees and the river droning by. She felt panic seizing her, shaking her. I'm not. It's not just them I'm afraid of, she gasped. It's me. I'm afraid of me. I don't want to be alone for 30 days. What will happen? Maybe I'll crack up or I'll find out that I'm evil. Mrs. Schmidt just shrugged. No one is all evil or all good. We all have both. Was Coyote all good? No. He could be a trickster, a liar, and a cheat. You will find evil, but you will also find good. And more importantly, you will find balance. Nancy tried to control her trembling. Are you sure I can make it? Maybe we haven't prepared enough. Mrs. Schmidt shrugged again. We have done what we could do in the time we had. You have purified yourself in the sweat, and you have already begun your fast. Nancy became aware of her shrunken stomach. For 4 days she had had nothing but broth and water. For 4 more days she could have nothing but water. Remember, Mrs. Schmidt continued, you have come here with a desire. You know what you want. What you are doing here is very hard. You are stripping away your false self, your false image. You are going to get down to your very core. And when you break down the body, that's when the mind opens. Then she pulled Nancy to her, hugged her, and stroked her hair for a moment. At last she turned to go. I will leave food for you on every 4th day, she said. She looked long and hard at Nancy. You are stronger than you think. You will find this out for yourself. So, of course, we have Nancy. And then our other character is Mrs. Schmidt. Even though so far she's not... I guess technically she's not in this chapter, but she is because Nancy is thinking back, right? So when this chapter opens, when chapter 12 opens, Nancy is by herself out in the woods. She's fasting, but she's having memories of talking to Mrs. Schmidt and thinking back to the guidance she got and just having these really vivid memories. The first night she'd been instructed not to sleep in the camp, but to wander in the hills above the sandy glade. As the sky darkened, she walked slowly and hesitantly up the trail that ran by the small river. The shadows under the trees deepened, blotting out even the meager light of the thin moon. She stumbled along the rocky trail, terrified of leaving it and becoming lost. What was she doing here? So she's had many moments. Of panic, and it really kind of freaks her out, and she has a hard time being out there by herself. The cold dawn shook her awake. Startled, she sat up and looked around. The weak sunlight was gleaming over the eastern lip of the valley and filtering through the trees. She looked above her on the rock. A foot above her head, a figure of a man had been painted in red paint under 2 lines. Next to the man was a bird, possibly a raven. Nancy stared at them, trying to fathom some meaning, wondering if they had been painted by another young woman on her spirit quest, desperately hoping that some message, written just for her 500 years before, would come clear. But there was nothing. The man remained standing silently under what may have been a rainbow, and the raven watched. Somehow those paintings soothed her. Others had been here before her. Others had survived this. She stood up and slowly made her way back down the trail, feeling not so alone. It took her almost 2 hours to get back to camp. The sandy clearing looked inviting, and she slumped to the ground, exhausted. And then when she gets back to the camp, she finds Mrs. Schmidt, who of course is bringing her food every 4 days. The rest of the day was spent praying, chanting, and singing with the beat of the small drum Mrs. Schmidt had left for her. The drum is the symbol of your heartbeat, she said. Listen to it. Sing with it. The next 3 days became a blur of running, hunger, vomiting, exhaustion, tears, and terrible loneliness. The smell of the fir boughs she placed on the floor of her tent mingled with her perspiration in the cold nights and mornings. She remembered begging Mrs. Schmidt to come get her, not to make her do this, and she thought about leaving, just walking down the trail and forgetting all the pain. And that's really important to keep in mind too, right? That there's really nothing keeping Nancy there except not letting down Mrs. Schmidt, and but it would be very easy for her just to pack it up and go home. She could do that, and when she's feeling this pain and isolation, and she could just pack up and go home, but she doesn't. She kind of she stays. But she stayed, and when the fourth day finally ended, she meditated after her run. There was a curious peacefulness. She had done what Mrs. Schmidt had told her. She had deprived her body of food, comfort, and warmth, and her mind did seem clearer now, like a muddy pool that had started to settle. There was less chatter in her head, more silence. Her thoughts had dropped away so slowly she hadn't even been aware of it, but now there was clarity, openness. And then she finds food that Mrs. Schmidt had left for her. And then the days became weeks. Nancy watched the moon disappear, then reemerge to grow larger and brighter. She watched the stars wheel in the night sky. She saw the dark shapes of trout dart in her pool, and she heard the grandfather trees creak at night in the soft winds. She watched as Saskatoon and wild rose leaves unfolded, and she picked wild asparagus that rose like spikes on open hillsides, and fiddleheads that unfurled under the trees. She was quiet now, and her thoughts were as clear and uncluttered as the pool. She sat in the growing warmth of the sun. It felt good. She sat in the silent chill of the evenings and the early mornings, and it felt good too. She didn't think about strength anymore, though she continued to pray for it. There was knowledge growing, and a sense of great peace, of balance and centeredness. But there was something more that was harder to define. It was the awe of the sunsets and the astonishment at the tiny forests of moss. It was wonder at the stars vibrating in the sky. It was feeling the life throb through the trunks of giant firs. It was joy at watching the squirrels leap in great arcs from tree to tree. It was hearing the water gabble through the rocks and knowing that there was nothing more important to listen to. And as conversations became memories, it was most of all knowing that she was not apart from all this great mystery. She cried, but this time it was for the rush of love and the union she felt. And so she spends a moment looking at the rock paintings on the wall, right? So I think that's the setting. I will say the rock paintings, the symbolism of this. I think the rock paintings are very very key to this chapter. So Nancy goes back and looks at these rock paintings another time. And this time, she looks down at herself. The fire danced over her wet skin, and she saw a new tautness that had never been there before. She was lithe and strong and beautiful. She knew she had changed. She could see it. But how much? Had she changed as much inside? So physically, she's changed by fasting and just being and exercising and running all day. But she wonders if she's changed on the inside. Suddenly, a large raven swooped into the clearing and perched on a rock 6 feet away from Nancy. It eyed her carefully, cocking its head from side to side. It looked familiar to Nancy, and she stared back, fascinated by the big black bird. Then it looked at her and opened its beak. For a moment, one fleeting instant, Nancy thought it was speaking to her, but it fluttered its wings, cawed loudly once, and leapt back into the trees. The next morning, Nancy carefully packed her sleeping bag, tent, and equipment after bathing. She stopped by the edge of the clearing and looked back. The ribs of the sweat lodge, stripped of its tarpaulin skin, blended into the bushes. You'd hardly think I'd been here, she thought. The great trees rose on all sides, and the river chattered. Come back, it seemed to say. We still have much to teach you. Nancy turned and walked the 2 miles to the trail junction. She saw Mrs. Schmidt, a green bandana tied around her head, sitting quietly looking out on the rivers. She turned as Nancy approached and smiled. It was a deep smile of love and respect and welcome. They hugged each other briefly and then stood back. They were both smiling now, looking at each other with shining brown eyes. Finally, they turned and walked together down the main trail. And that is the conclusion to chapter 12. So, Nancy counts her days, 30, on the spirit quest. She remembers her first day I would say her first day and first days and, being left alone. Slash, talking with Mrs. Smith. And of course, she finishes her time and returns home. So that's the basic plot of this chapter. And as I've mentioned many times, the plot is, you have to understand a novel's plot too. That's the first step. You have to read it, and some novels you have to read a couple of times, or you have to reread it, a certain chapter to really get what's happening. I think I've read this novel twice, front to back. I think I've read it twice, and that's probably the third time that I've read that chapter. I read it last night, and then I've read it on the air with you just now, and then I'm noticing even more stuff. Right, so it's you typically read a chapter the first time just to simply understand what happened, and then when you go back to it a second time, that's when you start to see these deeper meanings, right? And that's what we haven't really talked about here is like the conflict and the theme of what's happening, right? And then so we're really seeing that theme of personal transformation, right? So there's personal transformation. Interestingly enough, here I think one theme that really kind of comes through is self-doubt and overcoming it, right? So this theme of not believing in your own abilities and being scared and anxious and not able to push through, and because that's what Nancy has to do, right? She's in a very difficult situation. She's lost. She doesn't know where she fits in. One of her close friends has died, right? And she's overwhelmed with this feeling of injustice in her town and her inability to like do anything about it. So she's got a lot going on, and she needs to sort of confront it and push through it. And it truly is inspiring to see her do that throughout the course of the novel, right? So you've got these themes of personal transformation, self-doubt, how we overcome doubt, being one with nature, connections, that kind of thing. And the conflict, the problem facing the main character, I would say the main conflict of this chapter is really Nancy versus Nancy, number one. Number two, there's Nancy versus nature. So first and foremost, this chapter is delving into Nancy's conflict with herself, her own inner thoughts, right? So this is her inner thoughts. It's also old Nancy versus new Nancy, and that's a conflict that every human has to deal with. The person I was 5 years ago is not the person I am now, right? And you're constantly having that inner battle, right? Nobody stays the same, and from day to day, year to year, we become different people, and then we have to sort of confront the person that we once were. So as Nancy is transforming and as Nancy is becoming this new person, she has to confront her old feelings and her old emotions and her old way of looking at the world. And then I would say, secondly, this chapter is about Nancy versus nature, and sort of like not fighting nature, but ultimately at the end just finding her place within nature, and finding how she fits into uh, really, I mean, how she fits into like the universe itself, right? How she fits into like existence itself. Like she's this truly is a spirit quest in the deepest meaning of the world, right? Nancy is not out there on a camping trip, right? She's not hunting and fishing. She is really getting into it and finding out who she is. So that's where we'll leave it today, and then tomorrow we'll look at chapter 15, which is the second last chapter of the book, and then our novel study will be over, and we'll go into week number 9.